The two-state solution for Israel and Palestine is a mantra government officials repeat, knowing it's bullshit.
We support a two-state solution.
Two states living side by side.
Two-state solution.
Two-state solution.
Two-state solution.
Two-state solution.
It was always a distraction so Israel could keep stealing more Palestinian land under the cover of an illusory peace process. It wasn't a solution so much as a delusion. And it worked. After decades of negotiating for two states, Israel is an apartheid state with little islands of Palestinian ghettos under Israeli control. That's how the supposed Palestinian state went from looking like this to looking like this. Disconnected Palestinian areas surrounded by Jewish settlements. Former Israeli leader and infamous butcher of Sabra and Shatila, Ariel Sharon, explicitly laid out the strategy, saying, "We'll make a pastrami sandwich of them. We'll insert a strip of Jewish settlement in between the Palestinians and another strip of Jewish settlement right across the West Bank, so that in 25 years' time, nobody will be able to tear it apart." Two states will never happen. Israel deliberately made that impossible. That's because Israel is a settler state built on the deliberate removal of 750,000 Palestinian natives in 1948, what Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, as part of a European colonial project driven by the ideology of Zionism, or Jewish nationalism. Wait, can I still say that, or did Facebook already ban criticism of Zionism at the behest of the Israeli government? The Zionist project to seize Palestinian land and expel Palestinians continues. But maintaining a Jewish majority requires denying the basic rights of non-Jews, as well as continuous ethnic cleansing, making so-called facts on the ground, that is, Jewish settlements, to physically block a Palestinian state. The two-state solution was already a usurpation of Palestinian rights, denying them the right to return to the towns from which they were cleansed in 1948, and relegating them to the remaining 22% of their original territory. By getting Palestinians to agree to a two-state solution that would never ever happen, the Israelis bought themselves time to change the facts on the ground for their pastrami sandwich. What actually exists is one state, with about 7 million Jews ruling over 6 million Palestinians. Despite the Israeli state policy controlling both groups, only one has full rights. So much for the only democracy in the Middle East. There are 1.6 million Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. They or their ancestors survived 1948. They're second-class citizens who face institutionalized discrimination, with 50 laws on the Israeli books that explicitly discriminate against non-Jewish citizens of Israel. Another 4.5 million Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza, under brutal Israeli military control for the crime of not being Jewish. They have zero civil rights. When elections take place in Israel, these people are excluded from voting for the government that controls their lives. Some 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank are walled off by Israeli separation barriers that snake across their neighborhoods, unofficially annexing Jewish settlements into Israel, while relegating Palestinian neighborhoods to exclusion zones, with separate roads and checkpoints that control their every movement. Gaza is an open-air prison where nearly 2 million people are under Israeli air, land, and sea blockade. Israel even regulates the caloric intake of each resident. Israel claims it ended the occupation of Gaza, but if you control who can enter and exit, imports, exports, airspace, and the sea, then you control the population. Palestinians have been shot by the hundreds for even approaching the high-tech border fence. Israel created the most sophisticated and effective mechanisms of control in the world, while everyone was distracted by two states. Liberals say two states is the only option because one state would mean Jews might be in the minority. This argument is straight up bigotry. Imagine we were talking about white and black people. It would be totally unacceptable for liberals to argue against giving black people rights because it would undermine whites as a majority. So why do we accept it with Israel-Palestine? We certainly wouldn't tolerate someone talking about the threat of a growing Jewish population, but Western officials routinely warn of too many Palestinian babies. So what if they're the majority? Either you support equal rights for all, or you don't. Even progressive American politicians are guilty of this overt racism.
Over time, realities are bearing down on Israel. Demographic realities, births and deaths, what the region looks like.
This is the same argument made in favor of apartheid South Africa. The same was argued in favor of segregation in the Jim Crow South. That to give black people equal rights would undermine white demographic rule and make white people less safe. The oppressor class fearing that the oppressed will do to them what they've done. Look, if your state requires demographic engineering to maintain an ethno-religious majority, then you're not liberal. You're not a democracy, and you don't belong in the fucking 21st century. When liberal Israelis warn against right-wing policies, it's not based on human rights concerns, but because it'll harm Israel's image as a democracy, or because they're afraid their Palestinian subjects will one day be granted Israeli citizenship. and Jews will lose their privileges. The Israeli left warns that Israel will become an apartheid state. But it already is! It's already denying civil rights to non-Jews and bestowing the state's largest on Jews in illegal settlements. It already has one set of laws for Jews and another to subjugate non-Jews. South Africa wasn't a democracy that also practiced apartheid. It wasn't a democracy because it practiced apartheid. It granted some autonomy to townships and Bantustans, just as Israel lets the Palestinian Authority police its own people and deal with their sewage. If Israel wants to be a democracy, then it must end all discrimination in the territories it administers, which includes the West Bank and Gaza, and grant equal citizenship to the residents living between the Mediterranean and Jordan. But the Biden administration is sticking by this two-state charade. Not only does Israel get to keep stealing Palestinian land, it gets to keep the Syrian land it stole too.
Will your administration, the Biden administration, continue to see the Golan Heights as part of Israel?
Look, leaving aside the legalities of that question, as a practical matter, the Golan is very important to Israel's security as long as Assad is in power in Syria.
Does this mean Israel's gonna be pro-Assad now? You know, legal issues aside, I can steal your car now because keeping it for myself makes me feel safe. If the Biden administration was serious about peace, they'd be honest. But they can't do that. Israel's an important arm of American imperialism in the region.
It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Israel's a client state that enforces American hegemony onto its neighbors through bullying and war. It was the first sectarianized country imposed on the Middle East, and its creation reshaped the entire region, setting it on a course for conflict, war, and chaos up until today. And there are the powerful pro-imperialist lobbying groups that police American politicians on this issue. There's even a book about it that of course made the lobby go mad. So Palestinians will continue living in misery as non-citizens in Israel and in multi-generational refugee camps all across the Middle East. Also, Israel can have its ethno-supremacist state. A Palestinian whose dad was kicked out of his home in 1948 or 1967 can't even enter the country, while a Jewish American from Brooklyn with zero ties to the Middle East beyond some ancient fairy tale can be gifted Palestinian land tomorrow and get a free house, healthcare, education, and guns. The irony is this is being maintained by a woke administration, promoting itself as being opposed to racism. America prides itself on democracy, yet here it is arming a Jim Crow settler apartheid state to the tune of over $3 billion a year, while feeding us lies about a future peace that will never be. So how much longer are we going to pretend that there's a two-state illusion at the end of this tunnel? How much longer until those who claim to be liberal support the obvious solution? One state with equal rights for all. If the past is a guide, then Palestinians face a bitter future.